Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Abby Lester, and I am the director of the JDC Global Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture by Devi Mays, which is the second program in our webinar series on the Latin American and Caribbean Jewish experience in the 20th century. First, a few words about the archives. The JDC Archives, with locations in both New York and Jerusalem, houses the records of the organization since its creation over 100 years ago. The Archives is an unparalleled repository of modern Jewish history. Its vast holdings document JDC's global humanitarian mission, activities, and partnerships from World War I to the present, and in so doing provides an exceptional perspective on JDC's global humanitarian work in over 90 countries. One of the most important repositories in the world for the study of modern Jewish history, visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, genealogists, journalists, curators, filmmakers, and others. To support scholarly research in our collections, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. Our speaker today, Dr. Devi Mays, is Associate Professor of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Michigan. Her book, Forging Ties, Forging Passports, Migration and the Modern Sephardi Diaspora from Stanford University Press in 2020, won the 2020 National Jewish Book Award in Sephardic Culture, the American Historical Association's 2021 Dorothy Rosenberg Prize, the 2021 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association for Jewish American Studies, in the category of Modern Jewish History, Africa, Americas, Asia, and Oceania, and the 2021 Alexa Naff Prize for Middle Eastern Diaspora Studies. The title of Dr. May's lecture today is the same as the book, Forging Ties, Forging Passports, Migration, and the Modern Sephardi Diaspora. Our format is as follows. Dr. Mays will speak for about 45 minutes. We will then entertain questions for 15 minutes. Please note that your microphones are turned off, and we will take questions only via the Q&A function in Zoom. You can send us questions at any time throughout the lecture. And Dr. Mays will now start her presentation.
Hello, and thank you all for joining today and for the JDC inviting me to share my work with you. Yes, so thank you very much for joining me today. Gabriel Yermia Valenci's passport told many tales and hid many more. Unlike today's standardized booklet, this passport was one large sheet of paper, which you see before you today, folded over many times to fit within a wallet or a breast pocket. Its front bore a large eagle in profile, perched on a cactus, devouring a rattlesnake in front of the looming Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl mountains in the background. Below this, the Mexican Foreign Ministry, who issued this passport, noted that it had been issued to this man named Gabriel Yermia Valenci in July of 1920 for passage to the United States of America, France, and Turkey. A small photograph of the suited and bespectacled Yermia was affixed to the upper left corner. Lest one be tempted to switch out that photograph for somebody else's, which was not an uncommon practice at the time, but not one of the stories that this passport concealed, a series of identifiers were listed on the left. Yermia was a Mexican national. He was 32 years old. He was single. He was a comerciante or businessman. He had brown hair, brown eyes, and no beard. The reverse side of Yermia's passport was entirely covered by visas and stamps, and you can see here different images of the back of his passport. And it was so full that a smaller piece of paper was taped to the side of his passport to allow for more stamps and visas to be added. The stamps and visas on his passport attested to the complex trajectory, layers of bureaucracy, and overlapping authorities that Yermia traveled as he made his way from Mexico City to Constantinople and back over the course of a year. There was a visa from the Consulate General of Greece in New York that he had permission to travel to Greece via France and Italy in August of 1920. A stamp from the Port of New York that he had passed through there later that August. A stamp that he had arrived in Greece, followed by an Ottoman language stamp that he had made it to Constantinople. Then by a penciled note from Constantinople in October 1920, signed by the Consul of Spain. Jeremiah then traveled back to France, passing through Marseille in June of 1921. There he received permission from the Mexican Consulate General to return to Constantinople in July. An entrance stamp from the French delegation of the Inter-Allied Bureau of Passport Controls in the Orient, permission from the Consul General of France in Constantinople to travel back to Mexico via France, and a visa from the Consulate of Spain in Constantinople to travel to France by sea on August 9th of 1921. The next day, he procured permission yet again from the French delegation of the Inter-Allied Bureau of Passport Controls in the Orient, this time to travel to Mexico via France. In Paris, the prefecture of police stamped his passport in December of 1921, and the Mexican Consulate General gave him permission for return travel to Mexico City on December 21st. He then departed the European continent from the Atlantic port of Saint-Nazaire in France and returned to Mexico. So there are layers, he's traveling, crossing many borders, going through many countries, dealing with so much bureaucracy, meeting with different consular officials, different prefectures of police throughout his voyage. The reason for his extended transatlantic voyage was also hinted at on the back of his passport. In May of 1921, the Consul General of Spain in Constantinople made note that Jeremiah had requested that his status be changed from single to married. He had contracted marriage in Constantinople with a young woman by the name of Fanny Levi on February 2nd of that year. On the surface of it, the folded, torn, taped, worn, water-stained passport of Gabriel Jeremiah Valenci tells the story of a young Mexican man who traveled across borders and oceans, who stood in lines at consulates and immigration checkpoints and registered with police prefectures, all in pursuit of marriage with a woman who would return to Mexico with him, with whom he would soon have a son, and whose parents would soon cross the ocean to join them. After all, what love story is complete without the hero overcoming obstacles to join his love? And the chaos at the end of World War I provided many such obstacles. This talk today explores how people like Gabriel Jeremiah Valenci made sense of what Mexican historian Mauricio Tenorio Trillo calls, quote, the world adrift, cast into the deceptively calm seas of post-war chaos. In a Mexico City reeling in the aftermath and reverberations of revolution, as in a Paris struggling to rebuild in the wake of war, or Salonika in the wake of fire, or in Istanbul or Izmir, where war had merely shifted fronts and enemies, people held no clear consensus on what the future might hold. Over the course of the past few years, millions of women, men, and children had died, whether on the battlefronts or in labor battalions, or of the famines and disease that racked the home fronts. In 1919, representatives of the great powers and a plethora of national and religious contenders argued over the fallen imperial territories and Woodrow Wilson's vision of national self-determination at the Paris Peace Conference. Who might be deemed to have the right to their own sovereign state? Who might instead come under the mandate of the great powers? Where would new state borders be drawn? In the age of national self-determination, how were nations to be determined? And what would become of those who did not fit neatly within the borders of states or nations? In effect, who would be declared the winners and losers of hostilities that had cost millions of lives? Many individuals like Gabriel Jeremiah Valenci, far removed from the halls of power, understood that the world in 1919 was not what it had been a few years before. They perceived that they were living in a period of change, although it was unclear what precisely the future held. As historian Dominique Ryle argues in her work on the contested city of Fiume o Rijeka in the immediate post-World War I period, many imperial subjects in a newly post-imperializing world did not see nationalizing states as the next obvious progression. Nationalizing states were not the obvious next clear step for many of the subjects or the individuals who had been subjects of empires. Post-war chaos upended clear concepts of what the future was likely to hold, and thereby what social, political, and economic order might look like. If long-standing empires had fallen, could not many options present themselves for the future? And yet people need a sense of future to ground the present. In the immediate aftermath of war, when states, authorities, and global leaders were still in flux, multiple futures seemed open and possible. Individuals therefore had to try to make sense of what they envisioned their personal and communal trajectories to be within the existing state of flux, and then to act accordingly to what they thought their future would be. For individuals and communities, documentations like passports and visas proved ever more crucial for forging new futures and paths of belonging, and for fitting into or moving between the new states and borders that were hardened in the aftermath of war. Indeed, Gabriel Yermia Valenci's passport concealed or gestured to other stories, at once less simple and romantic and more compelling for their complexity and authenticity. Gabriel Yermia Valenci was not the Mexican youth his passport said he was, though that was not discovered until several years later, after the birth of his son in Mexico. His new father-in-law, Abraham Levy, who joined Gabriel and Fanny in Mexico in 1924, was also not the retiree he claimed to be on his migration paperwork, but rather he was the much-loved first rabbi of the growing Sephardi community in Mexico City, who traveled throughout the country to perform weddings and circumcisions, and who sat without judgment among the Sephardi ambulant peddlers who, at the end of long days, gathered together at the Sephardi Café Bohor, just south of the Zocalo, the central square of Mexico City, where they drank raki and ate mezes and sang familiar songs. The date of Gabriel Yermia Valenci's initial arrival into Mexico, October 1917, hinted as to why he might have needed a Mexican passport for travel to Constantinople in 1920. His later naturalization petition didn't note his port of embarkation for Veracruz in 1917, or at what point he, a Turkish national according to Mexican paperwork, had left the Ottoman Empire. However, he was born around 1887, and therefore he was the prime age for mobilization into the Ottoman army during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, and into the labor battalions that Ottoman Jewish men often served in World War I. In effect, once World War I started, the borders of the Ottoman Empire were closed to the emigration of young men of military age. So men of his age would have faced difficulty in leaving the Ottoman Empire legally in the years before he arrived in Veracruz in 1917. Although he may have somehow finagled papers that authorized his exit from the Ottoman Empire, when he sought to return to Istanbul for a wife and for a rabbi to lead the growing Sephardi community of Mexico, he returned not to the capital city of the Ottoman Empire, but to a city under control of a melange of foreign occupiers. It was perhaps unclear that his Ottoman-issued papers would have been accepted by these foreign occupiers. All the more so if his Ottoman papers had not been entirely licit, or if he had himself earlier exited the Ottoman Empire under false pretenses. If World War I marked a profound change in the rule of law, political realities, borders, and even documentary regimes like the passport, which really became commonplace during and after the Great War, the immediate post-war period was characterized by authorities, communities, and individuals seeking to make sense of all of these changes and what those changes entailed for the present and the future. Possible futures exert a powerful hold over individuals' decision-making processes, no less powerful in that moment for their failure to actualize later. The instability of the immediate post-war period renders particularly sharp the different ways individuals envisioned what they believed to be likely futures in light of present realities, and the choices that they made to position themselves and those close to them most advantageously for that future. In doing so, their actions shaped the contours of what their lived futures became. Migrants and those who remained navigated transforming and unfamiliar layers of bureaucracy and authority as borders and powers changed around them. This required imagining and implementing new social and communal realities in light of divergent futures, of fitting oneself, one's family, and one's community into what seemed the most plausible future at any given point in an era of many possible futures. In this period of chaos and possibility, borders were redrawn and new authorities imposed themselves. Critically, too, meanings ascribed to nationality, class, race, gender, and religion were in flux. Countless Sephardi individuals like Gabriel Yermia Valenci and Fanny and Avram Levi made calculated choices based on their reading of the present in light of what they believed the future likely to hold, where they envisioned they might belong, and how they shaped themselves to belong and shaped belonging to fix them. So I'm going to take you from Mexico now to the Istanbul, the Constantinople that Gabriel Yermia Valenci would have returned to, and highlight some of the conditions on the ground in Istanbul that provided sort of fertile breeding ground for a number of Ottoman Sephardi Jews to decide to immigrate to the Americas altogether. On October 30th of 1918, the Ottoman Minister of Marine Affairs, Rauf Bey, and the British Admiral Somerset Arthur Gough Calthorpe met on board the British naval vessel Agamemnon in the Mudros harbor off the Greek island of Lemnos in the eastern Aegean. There, the two men signed the Armistice of Mudros, marking the end of Ottoman involvement in the hostilities of World War I. Several weeks later, inter-allied troops composed of British, French, and Italian soldiers entered the Ottoman capital of Constantinople and set up a joint allied military administration over the city. In a deliberate reversal of Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror's entrance into Constantinople on a white horse when he captured that city from the Byzantines in 1453, the French general rode from the quay below the Galata Bridge to the city's French embassy on a white horse given to him by a Greek Orthodox resident of the city. The symbolism of this gesture was not lost on the city's residents, who saw that the occupiers upended power dynamics between Muslim and non-Muslim populations. Inter-allied forces saw themselves as victors and as liberators of the city's Christian population, and they showed a marked preference for the latter in filling jobs that emerged over the duration of their administration of the city. These forces remained as occupiers of the erstwhile Ottoman capital until October of 1923 and the proclamation of the Republic of Turkey. At this point, the Turkish forces led by Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, took over the city's administration, and Constantinople was consciously transformed from the linchpin of an empire stretching across continents into Istanbul, a cosmopolitan backwater of a nationalizing state with its new capital in the Anatolian heartland. And you can see here in this photograph, this is a military parade of inter-allied forces marching down the Grande Rue de Pera, which is today Istiklal Caddesi in Istanbul. And you'll note that there are multiple languages on the signs of the shops on the street, and the flags of multiple countries, though notably not the Ottoman flag hanging. The Allied administration of Constantinople left multiple impression on Gabriel Yermia's passport. 2 visa stamps signed and affixed with postage stamps from the French delegation of the Inter-Allied Bureau of Passport Controls in the Orient marked Inter-Allied authorities' permission for his return and stay in the city. Greek Orthodox and Armenian residents of Constantinople enthusiastically welcomed Allied forces. Thousands of Ottomans gathered along terraces, high walls, and the Galata Bridge to watch the arrival of British warships, whose entrance marked the end of the Allied naval blockade of the city. A Muslim student at the prestigious Galatasaray Lycée described with pain the British, French, and Italian and Greek flags that seemed to dangle from every window in the first days after armistice. Other residents of the city perceived a sense of doom permeating the air, and these foreign flags as a signal of the change in administration and in political control over the city. With the signing of this treaty in 1918, the Ottoman Empire had signaled its defeat. Over the next 5 years, until the Lausanne Accords of 1923 marked the permanent end of the Ottoman Empire and the foundation of the new Republic of Turkey, the future of the Ottoman capital and of all formerly Ottoman territory remained uncertain. On an international political level, representatives of various groups sought to argue for the partitioning of Ottoman territory at the Paris Peace Conference. The Treaty of Sèvres, ratified in August 1920, just as Yermia was traveling to Constantinople, divided Ottoman territory among Entente powers and those deemed to have suffered under Ottoman domination. The chaos at the international level mirrored chaos in the Ottoman capital and elsewhere, as inter-allied forces sought to realign economic and political norms within the areas they now governed. On January 11th of 1920, Dr. Edgar Fischer, a professor of history at Constantinople's Robert College, penned an op-ed in the New York Times entitled "From Bad to Worse in Constantinople." In the immediate wake of the occupation, he wrote, "In the minds of all, Christian, Jew, and Muslim, there was the universal conviction that, come what may, the future could bring nothing in its train more heartrending or more terrible than the years of war." He went on to add that no one could have anticipated that a year into occupation, the situation would be more difficult, more uncertain, and more unsettled, end quote. The strict press censorship of World War I, briefly relaxed after the armistice, was reinstated with vigor by February of 1919. El Tiempo, which was the most widely read Ladino periodical of the capital, regularly bore blank spaces as a testament to articles that had been censored out. The Allied blockades of the Dardanelles during the war years remained in effect for more than a year after, preventing the arrival of commercial goods and foodstuffs into Constantinople, which augmented war profiteering and inflation and made it really difficult to find enough food. Policing fell under the auspices of underfinanced Ottoman forces and a hodgepodge of inter-allied police, 1/3 of whom were English, 1/3 French, and 1/3 Italian. Inter-allied forces were only to interfere with Ottoman police in matters that concerned foreigners and speeding, and the seizure of illegal firearms. And the latter issue was particularly of concern as frequent firefights broke out in Galata, Pera, and Istanbul, different areas of the city, often along national lines. This is a map that was put out in 1921, showing the different nationalities, and that would be ethno-religious groups often, that lived throughout Istanbul. And you can see here that, Istanbul was a city at the time that had a really diverse population. There was no majority population in Istanbul. There were, close to an equal number of Muslims and of Greek and Armenian Christians who lived in the city, and also a fair number of Jews. And they were often living in close quarters with each other, in close proximity with each other. And this sometimes, in the aftermath of World War I and at other points in Ottoman history, boiled over into outright conflict. There was also upheaval within the Jewish communities of Constantinople as groups clashed over various issues. One of the main issues that Jewish groups clashed over was Zionism as a possible vision of a Jewish future. Ottoman Jewish leaders had spent years deliberately crafting an image of their community as the model minority within the Ottoman Empire, arguing that Ottoman Jews lacked the irredentist nationalist claims of Greek Orthodox and Armenian subjects. And even Ottoman Zionists, who were increasingly visible after the Young Turk Revolution of 1909, presented a Zionism that would strengthen the empire as a whole, and that was not incompatible with the continued existence of the Ottoman Empire and of Ottoman Jews within that empire. After the Allied forces occupied Constantinople, the New York-based Ladino press recounted that a large number of Jews in Istanbul openly declared themselves in favor of Zionism and formed a powerful national Jewish organization under the name of Agudat Bnei Israel. This organization aimed to take part in the establishment of a Judeo-Ottoman national state in Palestine. So still seeing that this sort of a Jewish state would be embedded within a still existing Ottoman Empire. Among other goals, this group organized English classes in Jewish schools in the city and pleasure trips to Palestine, and they were to aid in funding for those who wanted to move there. After the occupation of Constantinople, one Ottoman Jewish memoirist noted that young Zionists came to, quote, behave a bit like Constantinople was a captured country. They marched on parade through the city in full public view. The chief rabbi at the time, Haim Nahum, and his supporters, though, waged war against the Zionists, insisting that, quote, the Jews are nothing more than a religious sect and should not join in the Zionist idea. These tensions persisted, but were increasingly refracted through a prism of continued attachment to the Ottoman Sultan versus Turkish nationalist movements led by Mustafa Kemal. In October of 1922, Kemalist demonstration that passed through Balat, which is, I don't know if it's showing up with my cursor, but it's a part of the city located on the south side of the Golden Horn, just inside the walls of the old city of Istanbul here. This is the area where Balat was. It was a heavily Jewish neighborhood of Constantinople. At this protest, one group of Jewish participants marched through behind a portrait of Mustafa Kemal with a picture representing the Ottoman and Zionist flag. At the same time, groups of counter-protesters, in contrast, shouted, "Long live Haim Nahum Effendi, long live the Jewish nation," as they marched in favor of the Sultan, with no overt Zionist symbol to be found. In the first group of protesters, it was possible simultaneously to support Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish nationalism he represented, and the Ottoman Empire and the Zionist project. After the establishment of the Turkish Republic the following year, however, coexistence between such ideas became increasingly untenable, and public affirmation of support for Zionism increasingly disappeared. And now I'm going to turn to the role that the philanthropy, and particularly the Joint Distribution Committee, played in Constantinople in this period of post-World War I chaos. In the years of the war, particularly in the period of the post-war armistice, we see the arrival of a new philanthropic force in the Ottoman Jewish world, to which Jewish communities and individuals turned for succor in Ottoman lands and in assistance to relocating elsewhere. This was the American-centered Joint Distribution Committee, which I'll call throughout today's talk the Joint. And this is a map that the Joint put together and published in 1923, showing where the main Jewish centers of Constantinople were. So whereas this map focuses on where different nationalities or different ethno-religious groups lived within the city, here you see the main centers of Jewish population. And you can see that there are Jews spread throughout the city on both Istanbul's European and Asian sides. World War I had thrown Ottoman Jewish benevolent societies into a prolonged hiatus, and their resources had been overstretched by large numbers of indigent women and children and a growing number of refugees. The central presence of the joint's philanthropic efforts during and particularly after the war indicated a new prominence of American aid organizations on a global scale and paralleled large-scale American and League of Nations humanitarian efforts in formerly Ottoman lands. Once the Ottoman Empire and France were declared enemies, the power of the French Jewish philanthropic organization, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, waned somewhat in Ottoman lands, while the imperial inter-allied occupation of Constantinople after the war led to the downgrading of the status of the German Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden philanthropic organization. American Jewish organizations then cast themselves to the forefront of Jewish humanitarianism in Constantinople and beyond. Tens of thousands of Ottoman Jews and thousands of Jewish refugees from pogroms in the Russian Empire were in dire need of assistance. The distribution of American aid, however, at times exacerbated intra-Jewish tensions within the city. In 1921, a representative of the joint penned a report on the Near East and the Balkan states. While couched in somewhat typical terms of disdain for Jewish residents of the Orient, the report highlighted the diversity of Constantinople's Jewish population that numbered, he estimated, 90,000 out of a total population of 1 million, or close to 10% or 1%. Right, is that, yeah, close to 10% rather of the Jewish of the overall population of the city. Constantinople's Jews, he explained, were divided into 4 subgroups, which were further divided along class and sub-ethnic lines within various distinct neighborhoods. The Sephardi community was the largest, numbering some 80,000. The Ashkenazi community, into which he collapsed those from Austria and Poland, was about 5,000 people. And then there was the Italian Jewish colony. The 4th group were Greek Jews, though he was unclear whether these individuals were of Sephardi origins bearing Greek papers or Romaniot Jews whose residence predated the arrival of Sephardi refugees in 1492. Finally, there was a 5th and what he called unconsiderable group of Jews from Persia, Georgia, Afghanistan, and other parts of what he called the Russian and Turkish Caucasus. 2,800 of the Jewish population of the city were orphaned children, and there were over 2,000 widows. Since wealthy Ottomans, Jews and otherwise, often had exploited loopholes to avoid conscription into the army or labor battalions during the war, most orphans were from the most indigent of families. And this is a photograph from the Library of Congress from 1921, showing Turkish, Russian, Greek, and Jewish street children. And this was really a problem in this city where there were all of these orphaned children, especially orphaned boys, who lived on the streets of the city and survived from begging or from pickpocketing. Not included in this estimate of 90,000 Jews were more than 2,500 Russian Jewish refugees from Ukraine and Romanian-occupied Bessarabia. These refugees were fleeing villages and who fled villages and small towns and cities to head to the Black Sea ports, left anti-Semitic violence that killed close to 100,000 Jews. And then they found themselves, upon arrival in Istanbul, in the most expensive city of Europe. Their cost of living in Istanbul at the time was the most expensive of anywhere in Europe. And it was the presence of these Jewish refugees that threw Constantinople's various other Jewish communities into an uproar. Joint Committee officials claimed that neither the Espanols, so the Sephardi Jews, nor the Jews of German or Austrian origins, quote, feel themselves very close to the Russian Jews. However, the Jews of Constantinople were not oblivious to the suffering of Jewish refugees. The new chief rabbi, Haim Bejerano, met with a number of orphaned Russian Jewish children, and he drew a parallel between their experiences being forced to flee their homes and the experiences that Sephardi Jews had in being forced to flee Spain some 400 years earlier. The chief rabbi's secretary wrote to the Alliance in France, explaining that all of the Jewish stores and establishments throughout the city were closed on November 13th of 1919 in protest of the plight of these refugees. It was difficult for the Jewish community of Istanbul to aid them, however, for two reasons. First, the political situation with the Entente in power makes it difficult for the Russian refugees to enter. And second, the housing crisis in Constantinople meant that refugees were often housed in bad areas. Constantinople's Jews, grappling with an unfamiliar structure of authority in the occupied city, had difficulty aiding co-religionists in the manner in which they would have preferred. The Ladino press of Constantinople wrote emotive articles about Jewish children dying of hunger as a result of pogroms and the Russian Revolution in Russia and Ukraine. And they held subscriptions to aid, quote, our brothers in Russia. We see this in Constantinople, but also in the Ladino press of New York, which regularly published on the plight of Russian Jewish refugees in Constantinople, noting in 1920 that 30,000 refugees were reliant on American aid to alleviate their misery. The following year, after clashes between Greek and Turkish nationalist forces, sent thousands of Jewish, Turkish, Greek, and Armenian residents of Izmir, Bursa, and other cities to Constantinople. So there were also internally displaced Ottoman refugees. A Ladino newspaper in New York, La America, proclaimed it, quote, the sacred obligation of our Sephardim to help alleviate their suffering, whether by donating money or old clothing. Russian Jewish refugees in Constantinople organized into a federation of Russian Jews, specifically for Russian Ashkenazim, a new communal group that established its own synagogue, which added to the already diverse Jewish landscape of the city, where there was already a Ashkenazi synagogue largely for Jews from the Habsburg Empire, multiple Sephardi synagogues, and an Italian synagogue as well. Many refugees were housed, at least temporarily, in the city's Jewish schools, synagogues, and orphanages. This displaced a number of Jewish orphans into private families. A small number lived in the Mesila Chadasha Jewish agricultural colony, founded some 18 kilometers from Constantinople. The close quarters in which refugees lived led to a proliferation of diseases in their residences. And an outbreak of cholera in December 1919 resulted in a call for mass vaccinations to avoid an epidemic. The following year, another outbreak of cholera was particularly acute in the camps holding Jewish refugees from Crimea in Constantinople, which resulted in widespread death within the camp and a quarantine to ward off the disease spreading throughout the city. By 1922, there were a reported 80,000 Jews in Istanbul relying on foreign aid. This included the most recent 2,000 new arrivals fleeing pogroms from Russia and a number of war orphans, which were in part housed in the newly established Jewish orphanage of Ortaköy. And if you've seen the Netflix television show The Club, you will have seen this building. It's one of the locations where that story takes place. The Rockefeller Foundation and other aid organizations called on the League of Nations to match their donations in the aid of some 150,000 refugees in Constantinople who were Armenians, Greeks, Turks, Russians, and other nationalities living in miserable conditions. Within this morass of survivors of displacement and violence, often living in close contact with those who had perpetrated violence against them, non-Jewish aid organizations were unlikely to devote specific attention to Jewish refugees. And so Jewish communities and individuals, whether in Constantinople or elsewhere, relied on international Jewish organizations like the Joint or B'nai B'rith to pick up the slack and help to care for Jewish refugees and indigent Jews in the aftermath of war. The Joint's efforts in Constantinople oscillated between facilitating migration and providing refugees with the financial means of integrating into Constantinople. By August of 1920, they had secured over 1,000 visas for Ukrainian Jewish migrants to reunite with relatives in the Americas. And this included, for example, the Mendele Yiddish Theater Group, who had faced difficulties in Constantinople because they said Sephardi Jews did not understand Yiddish, wealthy Ashkenazim, quote, do not care for art, and the immigrated Ashkenazim, that is, the refugees, could not afford to attend the theater. In fact, the internal disputes among the different Jewish communities now present in Istanbul transformed this city into what one joint official called their Waterloo. In the words of a joint report from 1921, quote, "What I found was a beautiful facade kept upright with great pains, awful confusion and unscrupulousness, and almost criminal circumstances inwardly," end quote. On August 28th of 1922, the preliminary organizing meeting for a central reconstruction committee of Constantinople was held at the chief rabbinate's office in Pera. Chief Rabbi Bejarano presided over a meeting that included representatives of the Joint, the Sephardi community of the city, the Central Commission for Aid, the Committee for Aid to Jewish Refugees, and the Federation of Mutual Aid for Jews of Russia. The Joint expressed its commitment to reconstructing Jewish life in war-ravaged areas. "If the Jews of America have any right to be proud," explained the Joint's representatives, "it is for the humanity and responsibility which the war has taught them." As the Joint's efforts shifted from relief to reconstruction, it saw its new burden not as giving alms, which it understood as humiliating both for the giver and receiver, but as contributing to stronger Jewish societies. Quote, "No distinction should be made between Russian Jews, Sephardim, Italian Jews, and Ashkenazim. Funds are collected in America indiscriminately from all Jews. There should be no question of Sephardi Jews, Ashkenazim, etc., but only of Jews," end quote. In spite of calls for Constantinople's Jews to look beyond these sub-ethnic distinctions, members of these different communities expressed dissent. Representatives of the Sephardi community claimed that they were not sufficiently financially stable to be able to contribute to reconstruction efforts. Russian Jews wanted autonomy from any central organization since, quote, "the conditions of the life of Russian Jews are quite different to those of other Jews who have already taken root in the country," end quote. Zionists refused to take part in the meeting, but they demanded that Chalutzim be privileged over refugees. And according to those opposed to this agenda, the Chalutzim were housed in luxurious conditions at the Joint's expense while other Jews languished. All the delegates complained of difficulties in communicating across various languages: English, German, French, Ladino, Yiddish, Russian, Italian. While subsequent meetings led to the decision to establish a fund for small loans, Russian Jewish intransigence led to participating in group efforts, while simultaneously requesting a substantial portion of aid, created continued friction among the delegates. And members of the Italian Jewish community, meanwhile, also objected to the name Central Reconstruction Committee of the Jews of Turkey, insisting that this be changed to the Jews of Constantinople. So the Jewish community of Constantinople, particularly at the elite level, was really fractured along sub-ethnic lines, more so than it had ever been before. The Joint also sought to address the suffering of refugees as they awaited the visas that would bear them abroad. It published calls for employment in English, Ladino, French, and Hebrew for, quote, "the unhappy Jewish emigrants now in Constantinople," which was addressed to, quote, "all Jewish employers in Constantinople." One means that the Joint and its representatives saw for ameliorating the poor conditions in which Jews lived, whether refugees or otherwise, was by establishing a fund for small loans, which would give small, low-interest loans to Jews in Constantinople in need of petty capital for business purposes. These loans specifically were not to be distributed to emigrants or chalutzim. This fund offered loans to all groups of Constantinople's Jewish population, though its board was composed of Jews of Italian, Habsburg, and Sephardi origins with roots long in the Ottoman capital and the ability to process requisite paperwork in Ottoman Turkish. B'nai B'rith was the largest local contributor to the fund, which was followed by the Italian community and the chief rabbinate. The Ashkenazi community, placed on equal footing with the Sephardi community in terms of the number of representatives it had on this board, contributed substantially less than the Sephardi community, which also led to ire from the Sephardi community. However, Sephardi Jews actually benefited from the vast majority of loans. In 1923, this fund received 232 applications from 207 Sephardim, 10 Ashkenazim, and 15 Russian Jewish refugees. Among these applicants were small storekeepers, peddlers, artisans, employees, professional people, laborers, and those without occupations. And over 1923, the fund gave loans totaling 142,030 Turkish lira to over 1,800 applicants, of whom 85% were Sephardim, 4.32 Ashkenazi, and 10.47% Russian. The applications forms were printed in French, Ladino, and Yiddish, and they asked questions ranging from family status and dependence, the location of a prospective business, and whether they had a guarantor, the years of military service they had done, whether they had been injured in the war, if a man, or whether if a woman, she was a war widow. They asked no questions about communal affiliation or place of origin. So for Jews intent on forging a future within what was once and might still be the capital city of the Ottoman Empire, the fund and the joint provided a possible path for financial solvency. But armistice also heralded the opening of Ottoman borders to prospective emigrants and the reopening of its borders to Ottomans seeking to return, like Gabriel Yermia Valensi. The uncertain governance of the Ottoman capital meant that rather than receiving a passport and an exit visa from Ottoman authorities, as emigrants had done in the years before the armistice, those in Constantinople who wanted to emigrate now had to secure documentation from the British High Commission of the Allied military authorities in Constantinople. These individuals could not know at this time, however, that if they migrated out of the Ottoman Empire, or the occupied Ottoman Empire, on papers issued by Allied authorities, that this would later become rationale for denaturalization under Turkish law, and it would complicate any efforts that they might later undertake to return, whether to visit family or for other purposes. It is the beginning of one of these great events that you will encounter in history. In all the ports of the world, hundreds or thousands of ships embark with immense quantities of men, women, and children to transport them from one hemisphere to another, proclaimed a 1920 article in El Tiempo, Constantinople's most widely read Ladino newspaper. Numerous articles reported that hundreds of Jewish migrants boarded ships for South America and North America. As it had done before the war, El Tiempo featured advertisements for companies that offered tickets and advice for travelers to the Americas. Likewise, the bulletin for Constantinople's Ora Haim Jewish National Hospital in 1923 featured 3 separate advertisements that I have on this slide, 2 in Ladino and 1 in French, for Jewish firms that lined the quay in Caracoy, and which sold tickets to destinations such as North and South America, Cuba, Mexico, Buenos Aires, and Canada, and North America, in parentheses, New York, Canada, and Mexico, and South America, Argentina, Buenos Aires, and Brazil. Geographical subtleties aside, Ottoman Jews confronted far fewer obstacles to migration than they had in the years prior to armistice. For many Ottoman Jews, An uncertain future in foreign lands was preferable to an uncertain future in Ottoman territories, which was fast becoming foreign to its own inhabitants. The local Jewish communities in Constantinople, who contended with skyrocketing costs of living and economic instability, whose resources were further strained by large numbers of internally displaced Ottoman Jews and by destitute Russian Jewish refugees, encouraged and financially aided migration as a means of alleviating local burdens. Prospective migrants looked to local and international Jewish philanthropic organizations like the Joint for financial assistance to help them acquire visas and shipped tickets to the Americas. Well, Chief Rabbi Nahum was a key linchpin in a transnational network that linked Sephardi migrants throughout the world with family members in Ottoman lands. Philanthropic organizations assisted prospective immigrants operated along different subethnic and geographical axes. Menorah, the French language mouthpiece of the B'nai B'rith Lodge in Constantinople, announced that the city's Italian Committee of Assistance to Jewish Immigrants would financially assist Jews in transit for Italy or Italian colonies, but it also helped non-Italian Jews. It aided some 720 immigrants destined for North and South America in the first 3 months of 1922 alone, and provided food for the entire journey to 230 immigrants destined for South America. So too did the Joint at times aid Ottoman Jews and Russian Jewish refugees in migrating to new lands. The Ladino press of the United States also provided information to prospective migrants on changes in immigration laws and suggested new destinations for migratory flows. After the 1921 implementation of American immigration quotas, La America explained that Jewish migration to Cuba increased daily in hopes of eventually going from the island to the United States. The following year, another American Ladino periodical, La Luz, reported that the Senate had extended the 1921 Emergency Quota Act until 1924. At the same time, it had tightened a loophole that had allowed those resident in Canada, Cuba, or Mexico for 1 year to enter the United States regardless of quotas. That residency period was now extended to 5 years. The Ladino press in New York frequently identified Spanish-speaking countries as locations where Sephardi migrants might flourish. And this is one such article called ¿Por qué los Sephardim deben pensar en México? Or why the Sephardim should think of immigrating to Mexico from La Luz from 1922. The Sephardi community in Argentina had a flourishing social life, a Talmud Torah that taught, quote, our true language, a society that aided ailing and needy Sephardi co-religionists, and flourishing Sephardi commercial houses. In Cuba, Sephardi migrants could easily acclimate because of the similarities between Ladino and Spanish. Should American laws restricting entrance not be reversed, our new immigrants, especially those who could not be admitted to New York, could gather in Cuba instead of remaining in their natal countries in misery or being returned to Europe after their arrival in New York. But should the economic situation in Cuba continue to be bad, quote, our Sephardim have the opportunity to emigrate from there to the nearby island of Puerto Rico or to Mexico, where the Spanish language is also spoken, end quote. Several Sephardi migrants who had migrated first to New York before heading to Mexico alerted La America that commerce in Mexico was developing and that, quote, our Sephardim in immigrating there would have a better chance of a good future, especially because the official language of the state is Spanish. And this article that I show on the screen highlights both the similarities between Spanish and Mexico, which would enable Spanish and Ladino, which would enable Ladino-speaking Jews to acclimate to the language much more quickly and easily than they could to English in New York, as being a vector for upward commercial and social mobility, but it also highlights the similarities culturally between Sephardic Jews and Mexico. It particularly makes note that both the Sephardi diaspora as a whole and Mexico were formed out of a traumatic encounter with Spain in 1492, which created these underlying cultural similarities, which would allow Sephardi migrants in Mexico not only commercial success, but also a feeling of greater comfort than if they were to immigrate to the United States. Or other English-speaking places, or even places within Western Europe. A leader of Mexico's Sephardi community stopped by the editor's office, the office of the editor of La America in New York, as he was traveling to Paris, to inform La America that a new foundation had just been formed in Mexico to aid new migrants, and that B'nai B'rith had pledged a large sum to purchase a locale with 25 beds where they could sleep. The newspaper once again noted that in Mexico, Sephardi Jews especially had a great chance due to the Spanish language. At least one migrant in New York decided to relocate to Mexico. And there were many, actually, there were quite a lot of Jews, Sephardi Jews who immigrated first to Mexico, or first to the United States, sometimes even acquiring American citizenship, and then migrated to Mexico. But one of these migrants advertised the purchase of his, or rather the sublet leasing of his 6-room apartment on Madison Avenue near 114th Street in New York on the condition that the renter also purchase the furniture that he had in this apartment. I'll turn to the conclusion. Many imperial subjects in a newly post-imperializing world did not see nationalizing states as the obvious next progression. Rather, some sought to align themselves with whatever they deemed the next great empire to be, while others sought to extricate themselves entirely by relocating to new lands across seas and oceans. Whether in stasis or flux, individuals of all stripes were forced to consider and reassess the places for themselves in their communities, and to position themselves for whatever future they deemed most likely to come to pass. The upheaval that accompanied the end of World War I marked the transformation of Jewish geographies. Long-standing land-based empires with large Jewish populations were defeated, while new, different types of imperial powers exerted themselves over many of these lands. Many Jewish residents of now defunct empires sought new lands where they could craft futures equally as new as those they were leaving behind, in lands themselves undergoing turmoil and transformation. This mobility, sometimes forced, propelled migrants and refugees across the globe. It pushed them to engage with new, unfamiliar and transforming documentary regimes. The chaos and uncertainty that reigned in the aftermath of global upheaval prompted individuals and communities to forge new trajectories and new paths of interaction, even as they attempted to reconnect after years of upended communications. But increasing contact in a world suddenly more open to movement, but a movement now regulated by paperwork and increased oversight, did not entail the erasure of difference and the lack of conflict. When Gabriel Yermia Valenci made the decision to use falsified documentation to acquire a Mexican passport, he likely did so because he saw Mexican documentation as necessary for his complicated transatlantic voyage, with transit through multiple countries, immigration and customs stations, and police prefectures. In the aftermath of the Great War, when the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, where Yermia had been born, was under inter-Allied occupation, it may have been unclear to him that whatever Ottoman documentation he held would be valid or advantageous for such an endeavor. The archival record does not preserve Yermia's Ottoman travel documents, nor any record of when or how he arrived in Mexico originally. When he returned to his natal city to marry Fanny Levy and to prepare for the migration of her father Abraham, who would become Mexico's first Sephardi rabbi, he was likely very aware that the city to which he returned was very different from the one he had left behind. For Gabrielle and Fanny, navigating a world of still possible and no longer possible futures. For them, it required casting their lot elsewhere, and where they chose to cast it was Mexico. So I'll conclude my talk there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I realize that some of the talk, much of the talk did not actually address the situation on the ground in Mexico or elsewhere in Latin America, and I am more than happy to answer questions on that, especially, or any other questions you may have.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Mays. Thanks on behalf of all of us for your very interesting lecture. I think we've all learned quite a bit. And as you offered, we are now opening the floor to questions. Just a reminder that your microphones are turned off, and we're taking questions via the Q&A function. And we do have a few questions here. 1 second. Okay. First, we can start off with a question about some numbers. When you're speaking about Ukrainian and Bessarabian Jewish refugees in Constantinople, you referred to nearly 100,000 Jews killed in what the author of the question imagines were the early years of the Soviet Union. Were those Jews killed essentially in the Civil War in USSR's early years? And were the people who killed the Jews particularly from White Russian forces? This person's interested in bibliographic references, but that can be done separately.
So I'm not an expert on Russian Jewish history, but I do highly recommend a book written by one of my colleagues here at the University of Michigan on this topic, Jeffrey Weidlinger. It's called In the Midst of Civilized Europe. And it is about essentially these pogroms that happened within Ukraine, predominantly Ukraine, but elsewhere as well. And some of the perpetrators of these violence was White Russians, and a lot of White Russian refugees also ended up in Constantinople. So there's some accounts of Jewish refugees encountering the same people who had perpetrated violence against them. But a lot of the violence was also perpetrated by other nationalist groups within, non-Soviet or non-White Russian nationalist groups within Ukraine and elsewhere. Yeah, but I refer you to Jeff's work In the Midst of Civilized Europe for a really detailed and engaging discussion of that.
I agree. So how were the Sephardi communities received by existing communities in Latin America?
Yeah, so it really depends on the country that they went to, and on existing Jewish communities in those countries. One of the interesting, one of the things that I found especially interesting and maybe a bit unique about Mexico was that there was not a large pre-existing Jewish community within Mexico when Sephardi Jews started to arrive. And so they arrived in relatively equal number with Ladino-speaking Sephardi Jews were relatively equal in number to early Jewish arrivals who spoke Yiddish, but also Arabic-speaking Jews that came from largely Syria to Mexico. And so what you see in Mexico is that the Jewish communities, there's sort of multiple Jewish communities that are being created at the same time. Initially, they're under one umbrella. And then soon after World War I, they split into separate, distinct Jewish communities that still exist today in Mexico, where there's sort of an overarching Jewish community, but that's actually 4 distinct sub-communities: for Ashkenazi Jews, for the people who call they're called the Sephardim or Los Turcos, which are the descendants of Ladino-speaking Jews; for Halabi Jews, the Halabi community, for the descendants of Jews from Aleppo; and the Shami community for the descendants of Jews from Damascus. So these internal Jewish distinctions split up, the communities split apart and established their own synagogues and schools in the 1920s. But before that, they were all sort of under the same umbrella and relatively the same size. And so Sephardi Jews, Ladino-speaking Jews in Mexico were actually in a way positioned as the intermediaries between the municipalities, the municipal governments in Mexico, and the national government, and the other Jewish communities, because of knowing Ladino allowed them to actually communicate more easily in Spanish, and that they became sort of the like the intermediaries, as I said. And so socially and sort of culturally, they were, in a sense, towards the top of a Jewish hierarchy within Mexico. But you see different dynamics in places where there's, say, like, the United States, where there's a much larger pre-existing Ashkenazi community, or in places like Cuba, where again there was a larger already pre-existing Ashkenazi community. So it really depends on the country that you're looking at. Yeah.
Another question, did the Jewish immigrants, since you mentioned Cuba as well, did the Jewish immigrants move from Cuba and the Caribbean to North and South America later on?
Yes, yeah. So there were, in the basically before the Cuban Revolution, there were a lot of people, a lot of Jews moving around the Caribbean, including to the United States, but elsewhere around the Caribbean for trade purposes. That was pretty normal. But after the Cuban Revolution, much of the Jewish community, including much of the Sephardi community, left Cuba and relocated in large numbers to the United States, to New York, but particularly Miami. Yes, and there's still a small Sephardi community in Cuba today.
Great, thank you. Someone writes, I've been under the impression that the main Jewish immigration to Mexico in the 1920s had been of Ashkenazis, and it would be interesting to know if there are estimates of Sephardic immigration from the 20s on.
Yeah, so as I said, the early migration, so pre-1920s to Mexico, was largely equal in number between Jews of Yiddish-speaking, Ladino-speaking, and Arabic-speaking backgrounds. Ashkenazi immigration really took, all Jewish immigration to Mexico took off in the 1920s, in part in response to American immigration quotas. And it's hard to get to ascertain precise numbers because neither Jewish communities kept those numbers, nor did the Mexican government actually monitor the religion of, or like tally up the religion of incoming migrants. They categorized people based on nationality rather than religion. And so it's hard to come up with precise numbers. But, I would say that there were, still maybe a plurality of Ashkenazi migrants in the 1920s, but the majority would have been formerly Ottoman Jews, although this was divided between Arabic and Ladino-speaking Jews.
Okay.
Which is still the case, I would say, for Mexico today, where Ashkenazi Jews don't make up the majority of Mexico's Jewish population.
Do you know of any agricultural colonization societies besides Argentina or Brazil that were helped by the ICA to migrate from Constantinople or the former Ottoman Empire?
Not from Constantinople per se, but there was actually a plan that never went forward to establish a Jewish agricultural colony in Baja California in the early 1920s. And it was not organized by the ICA, it was organized by a Chicago-based Jewish philanthropic organization and was aimed at to target largely Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jewish refugees. Yeah, but and there was correspondence with the Mexican president Alvaro Obregón at the time about establishing that. He was sort of on board, and then it never went anywhere. Yeah.
Great. Okay, we have a few more questions. Just taking a peek. Let's see. Okay, this is an interesting question. You mentioned a few times Chief Rabbi Chaim Nachum. Would he be the same rabbi of that name who came from Constantinople to Cairo?
Yes.
As the chief rabbi of Egypt until his death? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. And just a couple of other questions. Is there any similar info about Ankara Jews after World War I?
Ankara there was not a large Jewish community in Ankara yet immediately after World War I. The records of the Joint are actually among the richest records for what is happening in sort of formerly Ottoman territories, but much of their correspondence, they were really based out of Constantinople, although they also dealt with, had some efforts in Izmir and elsewhere in formerly Ottoman lands. And then in the records of the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Paris, which does have some information about the Jews of Ankara, but it was a much smaller community at the time, and not facing the same type of really upheaval and chaos that you saw in the larger Jewish communities of Constantinople and Izmir. So there's a lot more that I've come across in research about what's going on in those communities, both before and after the war, than about the community of Ankara.
Okay. Just two more, maybe shorter, quick questions. One is somebody wants to double check their Hebrew and Spanish. And the
Yes.
last slide, the headline in the last slide that you showed, they're asking, does it say why the Sephardim should think about Mexico?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, there we go. And lastly, this is a little bit of a big question. Are there history books on this subject that you would suggest?
I'm not quite certain what is meant by this subject.
Yeah, on this
So,
topic,
on this topic, if you're interested in learning, I have my email address at the beginning of the slide presentation. It's my first and last name at umich.edu. And if you're interested in the more bibliographic information about, say, the Jewish community of Mexico and its development, I can send, including Ashkenazi and Syrian Jews, I can send you bibliography for that. If you're interested about late Ottoman Jewish history or early Turkish Republican Jewish history, I can send you that. I can very happy to share resources with you. I just can't answer this off the,
yeah.
without knowing more precisely what types of books you're looking for. Yeah.
Understandable. All right. And they just dropped your email address in the chat as well. You know what? One last question came in. Would the Commando
Yes.
family in Constantinople, were they very influential in welfare for the poorer Jews in that city?
Right. So the Kamondos, they were a incredibly wealthy Ottoman Jewish banking family. They had relocated to Paris in the late 1860s, although they were still active in supporting Jewish philanthropic efforts in Constantinople and elsewhere. They didn't actually seem to be from the documentation that I looked at, and granted, I have not gone through the Camondo's archives in Paris looking for this specific question, but they didn't seem to be that active in post-World War I issues. I think by that point they had been, they were still, still interested in Ottoman Jewish matters, but maybe less directly engaged in what was happening in World War I, which makes sense because the Camondo's son was in the French army and killed in action during World War I, which led to a lot of personal upheaval and tragedy for the family. And so they may have taken less of an active role because of their personal circumstances. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. Those were a lot of really great questions. And I hope you've all found our program today interesting. Thank you, Devi, for presenting to us. The next program in our series on the Latin American and Caribbean Jewish experience in the 20th century will take place on March 27th. It'll be Dr. Dalia Wasner will give a lecture entitled A Pre-Revolutionary Cuban Memoir and the Creation of Pan-American Jewish Organizations. Invitations will be sent out at the end of the month, and you can register for it via the JDC Archives website and the link in the chat, which I think was just dropped in there. We hope that many of you will be able to join us. Please sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for these public programs. And thanks again, Devi, and take care, everyone.